The ballroom of Thornfield Hall glittered with 1,000 candles, their light cascading down crystal chandeliers like frozen rain. Lady Alina Ashworth stood in the shadow of a marble pillar, her gloved fingers pressed against the cold stone, her heart beating so violently she was certain the Duchess of Marlborough, 3 feet away, could hear it. She had been searching for her husband for nearly an hour, hoping to share a quiet word, some small connection before the evening swallowed them both. She had worn the sapphire gown he once idly remarked brought out her eyes, though she wasn't certain he remembered saying it. She found him near the grand fireplace, surrounded by a circle of lords, Lord Pembroke, Sir Geoffrey Crane, the Earl of Whitmore. Their laughter rose above the string quartet, rich with the confidence of men who had never been denied anything. Alina paused, a tentative smile forming, ready to approach, when her husband's voice cut through the music with terrible clarity. "Marriage is a peculiar institution, gentlemen," the Duke of Ashworth said, swirling brandy in his glass with elegant carelessness. "One enters with the noblest intentions, only to discover the arrangement is unsuited. My own, I confess, was a mistake, a decision made in haste, bound now in perpetuity." The words hung in the air like frost. Lord Pembroke chuckled uneasily. Sir Geoffrey raised an eyebrow. The Earl of Whitmore had the decency to look uncomfortable. Alina could not move. Marble pillar held her upright, a cold guardian, a mistake. She was a mistake. The past year unspooled behind her eyes, the careful meals she planned, the estate accounts she mastered to ease his burdens, the hours she spent learning his moods, his silences, his rare smiles. She had believed he was merely reserved, that his distance came from the weight of his title, not indifference, not regret. A footman passed with a tray of champagne. Alina took a glass, her hand perfectly steady, and drank. The bubbles burned her throat. She would not cry, she would not flee. The musicians struck a waltz. Couples drifted toward the dance floor, a swirl of silks and satins, and Alina watched them as if from a great distance. She caught sight of her reflection in a gilded mirror, a woman composed, beautiful, and utterly alone. Her husband had not seen her. He laughed at something Whitmore said, his head thrown back, his dark hair catching the firelight. Alexander Ashworth, 7th Duke of Ashworth, owner of half a county and the master of her heart, and he had just publicly reduced their marriage to an error of judgment. Alina set down the champagne glass with a soft click. The sound felt like a door closing inside her chest. Lady Margaret Finch, a notorious gossip with sharp eyes and sharper teeth, sidled close. "My dear, did you hear?" She let the question dangle, her expression a practiced mask of sympathy that barely concealed her delight. Alina turned to her with a smile that cost her everything. "Hear what, Lady Margaret? The music is so loud this evening, one can barely make out a word." Margaret's eyes flickered with disappointment. "Indeed." Alina excused herself with a grace she did not feel, gliding through the crowd, nodding to acquaintances, accepting compliments on her gown, as if the world had not just inverted. Each step felt like wadding through water. She reached the terrace doors and slipped into the winter night. The cold air struck her cheeks, sharp and clarifying. The moon hung low, silvering the frost-dusted hedgerows. She walked to the balustrade and gripped it with both hands, letting the chill seep through her gloves. Inside, the waltz played on. Her husband remained by the fire, unknowing, unmoved. Alina looked up at the indifferent stars and made a silent vow. She would never again wait for his affection. She would not beg for love from a man who saw her as a mistake. She would become someone who did not need him at all, and when that happened, she would decide whether he deserved to keep her. The carriage ride home was a masterwork in silence. Alexander Ashworth sat across from his wife, one hand resting on the leather seat, his gaze fixed on the window where the darkened countryside slid past. Alina had drawn her cloak tightly around herself, her profile illuminated by the flickering carriage lamp. She did not look at him. She did not speak. The silence was not unusual. Many of their journeys passed without conversation, but there was something different in it tonight. A density, a deliberate quality, as if she had taken all the unspoken words and folded them away somewhere he could not reach. He cleared his throat. "The evening was a success, I think." Lady Castlereagh seemed pleased with the attendance. "Yes," Alina said. "One syllable, perfectly pleasant, utterly empty." Alexander frowned. He was accustomed to her attention, her quiet efforts to draw him into conversation. She would usually remark on the gowns, the supper, some amusing observation about the guests. He waited. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel. She remained silent, her head turned toward the darkness. At Ashworth Hall, the footmen hurried to open the doors. Alina stepped down without waiting for his hand, a small deviation from custom that caught his notice but did not linger. She walked up the stone steps ahead of him, her sapphire skirts trailing, and disappeared into the grand foyer. By the time he entered, she was already ascending the staircase toward her chambers. "Alina." He spoke her name without thinking. She paused on the landing, one hand on the banister. The The candlelight from the chandelier illuminated her face, calm, remote, beautiful in a way that suddenly unsettled him. Yes, your grace, not Alexander, not even my lord. She had called him by his name exactly twice in their marriage, both times in the earliest days, before she learned he preferred formality. He did not know why hearing it now felt like a door being locked. I shall be in the library if you require anything, he said, though he had intended to say something else entirely. I require nothing, Elena replied, and continued up the stairs. The next morning she did not appear at breakfast, nor the morning after that. When Alexander inquired, his housekeeper informed him that her grace had taken to breakfasting in the morning room, a sunlit chamber on the east side of the house that he rarely visited. He told himself it was a minor change, a woman's whim. Yet when he passed the morning room later that week and heard her low laughter, she was reading to her lady's maid something from a novel. He paused outside the door, his hand half raised, uncertain whether to knock. He did not knock. He walked away, unsettled by the sound of her happiness in a room where he did not belong. Elena, meanwhile, was discovering the quiet rebellion of self-possession. She ordered books from London, histories, philosophies, volumes on botany and astronomy. She resumed sketching, an art she had abandoned after her marriage. She wrote letters to her sister in Cornwall, long, thoughtful letters that did not mention her husband once. The Duke had once been the sun around which her days orbited. She was learning to turn away from that light to find her own. One afternoon, she visited the estate's greenhouse, a glass cathedral of exotic plants that Alexander's father had built and his son had neglected. There she met Mr. Henry Thorne, the young botanist employed to maintain the collection. He was earnest, gentle-spoken, and entirely absorbed in his orchids. He did not treat her as a duchess, but as a fellow enthusiast, explaining the delicate grafting process with such genuine passion that Elena found herself returning the next day and the next. She began to keep a journal of the plants, sketching their blooms, cataloguing their origins. The work filled a space inside her that she had not known was empty. Alexander noticed her absences. He noticed the ink stains on her fingers at dinner, the stray leaf she once brushed from her sleeve, the way she smiled at nothing while staring out the window. He noticed that she no longer asked him about his day. He noticed, with a prickling sense of loss he could not name, that she had stopped looking at him at all. The invitation to Lord and Lady Hargrave's spring gala arrived on gilt-edged paper, and Elena decided she would attend in crimson. The gown was a daring choice, deep wine-red silk with a neckline that skimmed her collarbones, paired with the Ashworth rubies, which she had never worn because they felt too bold for the quiet, obedient wife she had been. Now she fastened the necklace herself, dismissing her maid's hesitant suggestion that the sapphires might be more appropriate. The rubies, Elena said, meeting her own eyes in the mirror. Definitely the rubies. She descended the staircase at precisely 7 o'clock, and Alexander, waiting in the hall, turned toward the sound of her footsteps and stopped breathing. He had seen his wife beautiful 100 times. He had never seen her like this, vivid as a flame, her dark hair piled in soft curls, her expression serene yet entirely unapproachable. The rubies glowed against her skin. She looked like a woman who had set something on fire and was not afraid of the ashes. "Shall we?" she asked, walking past him toward the door without waiting for his arm. The Hargrave ball was the event of the season, and the Ashworths' arrival did not go unnoticed. Whispers rippled through the crowd, not about the Duke, but about his Duchess. She had always been elegant, yes, but tonight she was luminous. Men who had barely glanced at her before now sought introductions. She danced with Lord Halstead, a handsome young viscount with an easy laugh, and then with Sir William Bayard, a decorated naval captain whose tales of the Caribbean made her genuinely laugh. Alexander stood near the punch table, his brandy untouched, watching his wife move through the crowd as if she had been doing it all her life. He had never seen her laugh like that. Not with him, never with him. The jealousy struck without warning, a sharp, possessive ache that tightened his chest and turned the taste of brandy bitter on his tongue. He wanted to stride across the room and take her arm, to remind everyone that she was his. But the thought was immediately followed by another, more insidious. He had told the world she was a mistake. He had no right to claim her now. Sir William leaned close to murmur something in Elena's ear, and she smiled, a slow, private smile that made Alexander's fingers clench around his glass. When the dance ended, Sir William bowed low over her hand, lingering just a moment too long, and Alexander decided he had endured enough. He crossed the room with the quiet, purposeful stride of a man accustomed to command. "Elena," he said, his voice low, "I believe the next set is mine." She looked up at him, and for the first time that evening her serenity flickered. not with guilt, but with something like surprise, as if she had forgotten he was there. "Is it? I don't recall promising you a dance. You are my wife." "Yes," she said, and the single word carried the weight of every night he had left her alone, every silence he had offered instead of affection. "I am aware of the fact." Sir William, sensing tension, discreetly withdrew. Alexander stood before her at a loss. The musicians struck a quadrille. Couples took their places around them. Elena watched him with an expression he could not read, patient, guarded, a little sad. "If you wish to dance, your grace, you need only ask. But you cannot demand and you cannot command, not anymore," swallowed. "Then I am asking." She considered him for a long moment, then she extended her hand. "Very well." Led her onto the floor, his palm pressing gently against the small of her back, and they began the figures of the dance. The rubies pulsed at her throat like a heartbeat. He wanted to tell her she was magnificent. He wanted to ask why she had changed. He wanted to apologize, but the Duke of Ashworth had spent a lifetime perfecting his composure, and the words would not come. So he danced in silence, holding his wife as if she were made of glass, while somewhere deep inside him a truth began to surface, sharp and undeniable. He was losing her, and it was entirely his own doing. The weeks that followed were a quiet battlefield. Alexander, for the first time in his life, did not know how to proceed. He had always known the rules, rank, duty, decorum, but they offered no guidance for winning back a heart he had carelessly broken. He began to linger in hallways he once passed without thought. He arranged for fresh flowers to appear in the morning room, tulips and hyacinths, whose meanings he had researched in a book from his library. He left her notes, brief, stilted things, complimenting her wit, her grace. She acknowledged the flowers with a polite thank you, the notes with a nod. Nothing more. Elena, for her part, had constructed a new life within the shell of the old one. The greenhouse became her sanctuary. Henry Thorne's gentle instruction filled her days with purpose, and the exotic blooms, orchids with petals like butterfly wings, night-blooming cereus that unfurled only in darkness, became her quiet obsession. She was sketching a rare blue passion flower one afternoon, her fingers smudged with charcoal, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up to see her husband standing in the greenhouse doorway. He was out of place here, too polished for the humid, earthy air. But his gaze was fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken before she steadied it. "You spend a great deal of time here," he said. "I enjoy the work." She returned her attention to the drawing. "Plants do not make empty promises. They bloom when they are ready. And they do not pretend." He flinched, almost imperceptibly. "Might I see what you are drawing?" She hesitated, then held out the sketchbook. He took it carefully, studying the delicate lines. "It's remarkable. You have a talent I did not know." "Is a great deal you do not know about me, your grace," the formality strung. He set the book down on the potting bench. "I wish to know more. I wish to—" He stopped, the words sticking in his throat. The Duke of Ashworth, who could address Parliament without a tremor, could not find the words to speak to his own wife. "I have been a fool, Elena." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for a moment the mask slipped. Behind her composure he glimpsed a depth of pain so vast it stole his breath. "Yes," she said softly, "you have." That single word, yes, struck him harder than any accusation. He reached for her hand, but she withdrew it, stepping back among the ferns. "I'm not angry anymore," she said. I raged for weeks in silence in my rooms, but anger is exhausting, and I have decided I will not spend my life consumed by it. You made a mistake, you said, but I am not a mistake. I am a woman of worth, and I will not be diminished by your inability to see it." Stood motionless, his hand falling to his side. She spoke with such quiet certainty, such hard-won peace, that he had nothing to offer but silence. She gathered her sketchbook and walked past him, pausing at the doorway. "I do not require your affection any longer, Alexander." The sound of his name on her lips, after so long, was a wound and a gift. "That is what you should understand. I have learned to live without it. The question now is whether you can live without mine." She left him in the greenhouse, surrounded by blooming things, utterly alone. That evening he sat in the library and drank 2 glasses of brandy in quick succession, staring into the fire. The scene played over and over, her face in the candlelight, the steady resolve in her voice, the way she had walked away without looking back. He remembered the night of the ball, his careless words, his friends' laughter, the warmth of the fire at his back. He had not known she was there, but that did not matter. The words had been true when he spoke them, or so he had believed. He had married her out of duty, a union negotiated by families, and he had resented the obligation without ever examining whether the woman herself deserved his regard. He had been blind, arrogant, and cruel. The library door creaked open, and his mother, the Dowager Duchess, entered with a rustle of black silk. She was a formidable woman, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, and she had never approved of the distance between her son and his wife. She settled into the chair opposite him and fixed him with a gaze that had quelled boardrooms. "I have watched you these past weeks," she said without preamble. "You are finally noticing your wife, I see. How inconvenient for you. Not mother me. That girl arrived in this house a year ago, bright with hope, and you treated her like a piece of furniture. I warned you. I told you she was extraordinary. Now she has withdrawn her heart and you are lost." She leaned forward. "Good. You should be lost. You should suffer. And then, if you have an ounce of your father's character, you will earn her back, not with flowers and notes, but with humility, with patience, with the truth." Stared at his mother. "What truth? That you love her, you foolish boy. You have loved her for months and been too proud to admit it. Tell her, and then spend the rest of your life proving that you mean it." Dowager rose and left him in the firelight, her words ringing in the silence. Love. He turned the word over in his mind like a foreign coin. He had never believed in love, not the kind poets wrote about, not the kind that undid great men. But the emptiness in his chest now, the raw terror at the thought of losing her entirely, that was not pride or possession. That was something far more terrifying. He loved her, and he had no idea how to make her believe it. The fever came without warning. One morning Alina was tending the orchids in the greenhouse, and by evening she was shivering in her bed, her skin burning to the touch, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The physician diagnosed a violent inflammation of the lungs, his expression grave as he bled her and prescribed rest. But the fever did not break. For 3 days she hovered in a delirium, murmuring names Alexander did not recognize, reaching for hands that were not his. He did not leave her side. The Duke of Ashworth, who had never missed a parliamentary session, cancelled every engagement, refused every visitor, and stationed himself in a chair beside her bed. He held her hand through the worst of the chills, his own fingers white-knuckled with fear. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, fed her sips of water, and spoke to her in a low, steady voice through the long watches of the night. "I was wrong," he whispered in the candlelit darkness, her fragile hand clasped in both of his. "You are not a mistake. You are the only true thing in my life, and I was too blind to see it. Please, Alina, please stay." Fever crested on the 4th night. The household held its breath. Servants moved through the halls on silent feet. The Dowager Duchess stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her heart, and watched her son crumble. He wept. Alexander Ashworth, who had not cried since he was a boy, wept beside his wife's bed, his shoulders shaking with a grief he could not contain. She was slipping away from him, not by choice this time, but by cruel, indifferent nature, and he could not bear it. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "I love you, and I have loved you since the moment you first smiled at me across a dinner table, and I was too terrified to smile back. I love your stubbornness and your grace and the way you bite your lip when you are thinking. I love the sound of your footsteps in the hall. I love the way you look at flowers as if they hold secrets worth knowing. I love everything about you, and I have done nothing to deserve you. But if you will only live, I will spend the rest of my life trying." The candle flame flickered. The clock on the mantel ticked. And then, faintly, Alina's fingers stirred within his grasp. By dawn, the fever had broken. She opened her eyes to find her husband slumped in the chair beside her, his face haggard, his shirt rumpled, his dark hair uncombed. He was asleep, but his hand still held hers. She stared at him for a long moment, piecing together fragments of memory, his voice in the darkness, raw with desperation, words she had thought were part of the fever dream. But seeing him now, the evidence of his vigil written in every exhausted line of his body, she understood. He had been there. He had said those things. She did not wake him. She lay still, feeling the slow return of strength, and let the knowledge settle over her. He loved her. The man who had called her a mistake now looked as if he had aged 5 years in 4 nights, all because he feared losing her. The irony was almost painful. She had spent months building walls around her heart, and now, in the hushed stillness of recovery, she felt the first crack. When he finally stirred, his eyes meeting hers, the relief that flooded his face was so naked, so unguarded that Alina's breath caught. "You are awake," he whispered hoarsely. "Thank God, I am awake," she confirmed, her voice a thread. "And I heard you," went very still. A flush crept up his neck, but he did not look away. "Then you know everything." "I know what you said." She withdrew her hand gently, not in rejection, but to fold it over her chest. "Words are easy in the dark, Alexander. I need to know if they remain in the light." He knelt beside the bed, a duke on his knees before his duchess, and took her hand once more. "They will remain," he said. "Every day, every hour, I will prove it if you will let me." Alina looked at him, at the man she had loved, hated, grieved, and somehow impossibly still loved, and saw something she had never seen before. Humility. Earnest, terrified, determined humility. "Then prove it," she said softly. "But know this, I will not be your mistake again. I will be your equal, or I will be nothing at all." He bowed his head over her hand, his lips brushing her knuckles with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. My equal, he repeated. Always. Elena's recovery was slow, and Alexander's transformation was meticulous. He did not smother her with grand gestures. Instead, he offered small, consistent proofs of his devotion. He learned her schedule so he could walk with her in the garden when she was well enough. He read aloud to her in the afternoons, books she chose, philosophy and poetry, not the dry histories he preferred. He asked her opinions and listened, truly listened, to her answers. He stopped issuing commands and began making requests. He stopped retreating to the library at night and instead sat with her in the drawing room, even if she was only writing letters and he was only watching the fire. At first, Elena was wary. She had built her walls carefully and she was not ready to dismantle them. But Alexander's patience was unrelenting. He did not push. He did not demand forgiveness. He simply showed up day after day and let his actions speak. When she expressed an interest in expanding the greenhouse, he funded the project without hesitation, even accompanying her to London to select rare specimens. When she mentioned a desire to sponsor a school for the village children, he arranged the meeting with the parish council himself. One evening in late summer, they sat together on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The air smelled of roses and cut grass. Elena had a sketchbook in her lap, and Alexander was reading a letter from his steward, but neither was truly occupied. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer a void, but a companionable stillness. I used to dread coming home, he said suddenly. She looked up from her drawing. Why? Because I knew I would disappoint you. I knew you wanted warmth and I had none to give, or so I thought. He set down the letter. The truth is, I was afraid. You were so bright, so full of life. I thought if I let myself feel anything, I would lose control entirely. Now I am terrified of losing you instead. He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes earnest. I have discovered that control is overrated. Loving you is worth the risk of making a fool of myself. Elena set down her charcoal. You have made a fool of yourself quite regularly these past months. I have kept a list. For a moment he looked stricken, and then he saw the hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. Have you? He asked, his voice lighter than it had been in years. Might I see this list? Absolutely not. It is my insurance. He laughed, a real, surprised laugh that crinkled his eyes and made her heart lurch. He looked younger when he laughed. She realized she had never given him a reason to laugh before. The thought made her sad and then hopeful. I am still angry sometimes, she admitted quietly. I do not know if that goes away. Then be angry, he said. Shout at me, throw things, I will still be here. He reached over and covered her hand with his. I am not going anywhere, Elena, not ever again. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. The gesture was small, but it was the first time she had reached back. They sat like that until the stars came out, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, beginning again. The autumn brought a harvest ball at Thornfield, the same hall where Alexander had once carelessly shattered his wife's heart. This time, Elena chose a gown of deep emerald green, and she descended the staircase with her head held high, her hand resting confidently on her husband's arm. The whispers followed them as they entered, not of scandal, but of curiosity. The ton had noticed the Duke's transformation. His absence from London clubs, his devotion to his wife, the way he looked at her as if she were the most fascinating creature in any room. Lady Margaret Finch cornered Elena near the punch table, her eyes gleaming with the hunger for gossip. My dear Duchess, you have positively bloomed. We rarely see you in town. Tell me, is Ashworth Hall as dreadfully dull as ever, or has something changed? Elena smiled, a genuine smile that held no malice. Ashworth Hall is quite changed, Lady Margaret, or perhaps I am the one who changed. Either way, I find I am content. Content? Margaret's voice carried a note of disbelief. Only content? At that moment, Alexander appeared at Elena's side, handing her a glass of champagne with a familiarity that spoke of daily attentions. I hope she is more than content, he said, his gaze resting on his wife with undisguised admiration. I hope she is happy. I work toward that end every day. Margaret's jaw slackened. The Duke of Ashworth, once so cold, so remote, was openly declaring his devotion. Before she could recover, Alexander led Elena away, his hand resting at the small of her back. You did not need to say that, Elena murmured as they walked. I wanted to. I want everyone to know. He stopped near the very fireplace where his cruel words had once been spoken. The same circle of lords was gathered there, Pembroke, Crane, Whitmore, and they fell silent as the Duke and Duchess approached. Alexander faced them with a calm, deliberate presence. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearby guests. I have a correction to make. Some time ago, I made an ill-considered remark in this very room. I said my marriage was a mistake. I was wrong. The mistake was mine alone, my blindness, my pride. My wife is the finest woman I have ever known, and every day I am grateful she has allowed me the chance to become worthy of her." Silence that followed was absolute. Then Lord Pembroke, ever the pragmatist, raised his glass. "To the Duchess of Ashworth." "To the Duchess," echoed the others, and the toast rippled outward through the ballroom until half the guests were lifting their glasses. Elena stood very still, her hand trembling slightly in Alexander's. She had not expected this. She had not asked for this. But as she looked at her husband's face, earnest, nervous, hopping, she felt the last of her walls crumble. Later they danced. Not the formal, distant dances of their early marriage, but a waltz where he held her close and she let him. His hand was warm on her waist, his breath gentle against her temple. She could feel the eyes of the Tun upon them, but for the first time she did not care. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I should have said it 1,000 times before now. I will say it 1,000 more. I love you." She closed her eyes, leaning into him. "I love you too," she said, and the words felt like coming home. Spring returned to Ashworth Hall with a riot of blossoms, and the greenhouse had never been more magnificent. Elena stood among the orchids, now her own passion as much as Henry Thorne, carefully transplanting a delicate cattleya. The earth was cool under her fingers, the scent of damp soil and greenery a comfort. She heard footsteps behind her, the familiar, beloved rhythm of her husband's stride, and smiled without turning. "I have been looking for you," Alexander said, his voice carrying a warmth that had become natural to him. "I should have known you'd be here. Where else would I be?" She brushed soil from her hands and stood, facing him. He was slightly disheveled, his cravat askew from a morning ride, and he looked at her with an intensity that still made her breath catch. He took her hands, soil and all, and led her to the wrought iron bench at the center of the greenhouse. Sunlight streamed through the glass, dappling them with green and gold. "I have something to ask you," he said, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the old nervousness in his eyes. "Ask then." "I have arranged with the parish council for the new school. The builders begin next month, and I hoped you might want to oversee the project yourself, not as my proxy but as yourself. Lady Elena Ashworth, patron of education, independent of her foolish husband." She laughed, delighted. "You are not foolish. Well, not entirely. And yes, I would like that very much. Is more." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper worn at the edges. "Do you remember this?" She took it and unfolded it, a sketch she had made months ago, a passion flower in charcoal, smudged and imperfect. Her first drawing after she had decided to reclaim herself. "Where did you get this?" "You left it in the greenhouse. I have kept it ever since. I look at it every day. It reminds me of who you were becoming, who you have become, strong, patient, and entirely self-made." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "I did not give you this. You built it yourself, and that is the woman I love. Not the woman who needed me, but the woman who chose me anyway." Slipped down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "I did choose you. I still choose you every day." Kissed her then, deeply and tenderly, in the glass cathedral of flowers, and it was not the kiss of possession, but of partnership. When they parted, he kept his forehead pressed to hers. "I have one more request," he murmured. "What is that?" "Marry me again. Not a renewal of vows, a new beginning. A ceremony just for us in the garden with no one watching but the roses and the sky." She pulled back to look at him, her heart full to bursting. "You are an incurable romantic, Alexander Ashworth. Is that a yes?" "It is a yes." The ceremony took place on the first day of June, beneath a canopy of climbing roses in the estate gardens. There were no guests, no spectacle, only the parson, the Dowager Duchess wiping her eyes, and the gentle hum of bees among the blossoms. Elena wore a simple gown of ivory muslin, and Alexander wore his best coat, his hands steady as he held hers. They spoke their vows in voices that only they could hear, and when the parson pronounced them man and wife, the sun broke through the clouds, flooding the garden with golden light. That evening they walked together through the grounds, past the greenhouse, past the reflecting pool, to the hilltop where the land fell away into a patchwork of fields and forests. The sky was streaked with rose and amber. Alexander wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I once thought my life was a series of duties," he said quietly. "Now I know it is a single gift. You." Elena leaned back against him, her heart quiet and full. "We found our way, didn't we? Through the silence, through the pain. You found your way. I simply followed the light you carried." They stood together on the hilltop as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the world settled into a deep, peaceful dusk. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a language they had learned together, a space where love could grow without words. And in that silence, they were finally completely home.